Consider, if you will, a town. You've never seen a hospital in this town. You've never seen a school. Instead, prepubescent children work full-time jobs without adult oversight. It's never really occurred to you that not one of them seems to have parents. The political apparatus of the town consists entirely of a mayor, so self-aggrandizing she erects a solid gold statue of her pet chicken right in the center of town, a move reminiscent of the dogs of the brutal dictator of Turkmenistan. Otherwise, if you're wondering where the town budget goes, direct your gaze to a tower, you can't miss it, on a defensible island with a single bridge, a tower topped with a retractable periscope so that it might, Sauron-like, keep watch over the world. Disguised around its outsides and from within its cavernous subterranean garages, pour forth a bewilderingly massive fleet of vehicles. Cars, trucks, ATVs, construction equipment, hovercraft, helicopters, boats, submarines, snowmobiles, and jet-pack sporting aviators. And all of it, for some reason, is under the command of a 10-year-old boy and his team of trained puppies. Every concert in town, every parade, every celebration seems to center around this circus-like emergency and law enforcement crew. Look now, there's an underage Dalmatian behind the wheel of a fire truck with the entire team on board, a truck that would plow through cars in its way if the roads weren't conveniently empty whenever the team came through, as if cleared in advance just for them. Look, the Dalmatian is hopped out of his truck, doing his work as the town's only medical provider. A woman has an injured leg. Voice activated, from the dog's backpack emerges a screen, which flickers to life as a fully operational X-ray, and is applied to the leg without the least regard for safety, probably ensuring everyone around will get cancer. Why does a relatively small town need such an overfunded rescue and law enforcement operation outfitted with enough military surplus to defend a small nation? Because the town is constantly under attack, primarily by the mayor of a neighboring town, who, aided by his underage nephew and crew of kittens, will twirl his mustache and steal anything that isn't nailed down. And why not? He knows he won't be punished. Not really. After all, the show must go on. No one ages here. Nothing changes except the emergency and law enforcement services' ever-expanding surplus of high-tech, military-grade equipment, continuing to pile up around, within, and beneath the tower. Created by a toy company literally called Spin Master, Paw Patrol continues the tradition of toy commercials as TV shows that dates back to the Reagan-era repeal of regulations regarding product placement in children's shows. This single act resulted in an onslaught of shows based on toy lines, and existing for the express purpose of selling them, including Transformers, My Little Pony, and G.I. Joe. Thus, we should at all times keep in mind the true express purpose of Paw Patrol is to function as the center of a marketing effort for an ever-expanding line of merchandise. Indeed, the most remarkable thing about Paw Patrol as a TV show compared to other shows of its type is just how unremarkable it is. It's not merely anodyne, it's actively backwards looking. I'm not sure I've ever seen another show quite so unexamined and unreconstructed. The lead human character is a white boy, and the core group of puppies are all boys except one, playing into the same self-fulfilling stereotypes of toy makers that boys don't want girl cooties in their entertainment, and white people won't tune into shows led by non-white people. Thus, shows aimed at boys or even cross-gender audiences will tokenize both boys and BIPOC. And of course, the girl puppy's color scheme is pink, because girl, and her femininity is signaled by extra-large eyelashes as if puppies use lash curlers and eyeliner. As per Minnie Mouse, Daisy Duck, and so on, the boy designs are the default, while the girl designs are boy designs with added lashes, bows, and other extra signifiers. Of the main cast, there are two token non-white characters, both of whose ethnic identity has no bearing whatever on their personality or background. The ostensibly black Mayor Goodway plays washtub bass in hoedowns, a style of music literally popularized as a way of countering the influence of black music in the 1920s. Goodway was even played by a white actress until season 7, a form of voice acting blackface. As for Farmer Yumi, the other non-white major character, she doesn't seem to have much personality to speak of at all. The main villain, Mayor Humdinger, meanwhile, is a sissy stereotype straight out of vaudeville, with the effeminate mannerisms historically linked closely with loose morals and cowardice. The show is, in other words, mired in moldering old tropes without the least self-examination or apparent knowledge of the larger discourse that's been going on for decades now. Where many other programs actively tilt away from this sort of thing, from Sesame Street to Bluey, and more progressive programs like Steven Universe actually work to undermine them, Paw Patrol embraces them enthusiastically and without the tiniest bit of irony. But then, irony doesn't really exist in the world of Paw Patrol. Where SpongeBob SquarePants crammed irony into every subversive frame of nautical nonsense, an adventurous Paw Patrol joke will at best consist of a pun. While SpongeBob characters might have complex, ambivalent emotions, Sandy the Squirrel's simultaneous care for and annoyance with SpongeBob, for example, there's no room for such complexity in Adventure Bay. And you may argue that the lack of complexity is due to the target age group, but SpongeBob doesn't exactly skew younger. No, in Paw Patrol, people are either good and trying to do good things, or they're bad and trying to do bad things. Even when characters should be annoyed, Marshall slamming into and knocking over the other pups in every episode, for example, no such annoyance materializes. There's no room for negative emotions here. And while the characters in the PJ Masks, for example, might learn and grow with a proper character arc over the course of an episode, and villains sometimes even switch sides on a temporary or permanent basis, there's absolutely no possibility of this in Paw Patrol. At best, a character might learn to have more confidence in themselves. At first glance, Paw Patrol isn't the most obvious show at which to level the accusation of propaganda. It's not about a police force per se. It's not Law & Order, Blue Bloods, or Brooklyn Nine-Nine, where a sympathetic portrayal of a police department is built into the show's premise. Only Chase even has a police theme, while the other dogs have such inoffensive occupations as construction worker, firefighter, ocean rescuer, or, strangely, recycling truck driver. And much of what they do falls into the category of search and rescue operations, as opposed to law enforcement. Even when Chase does get the spotlight, he's often doing such unglamorous things as directing traffic or laying down traffic cones. In the early episodes in particular, the pups were more likely to help baby turtles cross a busy road or find a lost elephant calf than do battle with criminals. I actually talked about the Paw Patrol in my previous episode about superheroes and the police, where I referenced the turnaround in Season 5, where the characters are exposed to a mysterious meteor and are granted superpowers. In that episode, I focused on how Chase the police dog is a model of what we imagine policing should be like: helpful, selfless, interested in lawfulness and justice without prejudice or rancor. However, I didn't at all touch on why it's a problem for the police to be portrayed this way so consistently throughout media. They're frequently lumped in with firefighters, for example, as real heroes. Meanwhile, other workers no less heroic, like EMS, don't get the same treatment and definitely don't get anything like the pay, remaining criminally underpaid and overworked. Police are thus presented as just another arm of the municipal services that keep us all safe, which is, of course, what they're supposed to be. And yet, the police's remit is different from that of firefighters, trash collectors, or construction workers. The police have unique powers over others, like the right to detain, imprison, and use violence. And the problem with giving any group power over others is that you have to be sure they use it responsibly. That kind of authority, after all, will attract exactly the sort of people most willing to abuse it. I'm not going to rehash the list of police brutality cases over the decades, not going to once more subject you to horrifying videos like the ones that set off the waves of protests last year. If you want that sort of thing, it's not hard to find. But I want you to consider something. Derek Chauvin was recently convicted after being filmed murdering George Floyd on camera. But there were 3 other police officers on the scene with him who have also been arrested and are awaiting trial. Why didn't one of them pull Chauvin off while he knelt on the man's neck for 9 minutes, while he begged for his life and asked for his mother? Well, we know why. Police who issue complaints about other officers are called rats, as if the police forces were the very criminal organizations they're supposed to be fighting, and shunned by their fellow officers, as famously in the example of Frank Serpico, but more recently Baltimore police officer Joe Crystal. This phenomenon is called the blue wall of silence, and is so well known it has its own Wikipedia entry. Even after the event, the police released an autopsy report that said there was no evidence of death by asphyxiation and blamed underlying conditions. A second, independent autopsy found that asphyxiation was indeed the cause of death. The police would rather lie than hold one of their own accountable. And to make matters worse, prosecutors are famously unmotivated to pursue police misconduct trials or prosecute them fully because they don't want to alienate the same police they have to work with. In other words, if it wasn't for the event being caught on camera and the widespread public outcry that followed, Chauvin would almost certainly have gotten away with murder because the whole system is built to allow him to. The current culture of policing in this country and the apparatus of law enforcement and prosecution around it discourages the existence of good cops. A good cop would have pulled Chauvin off Floyd's neck and arrested him on the spot for assault. But everything about our current police system makes that unthinkable. I have a friend on Facebook who complained of a neighbor harassing her. The problem was that the neighbor was a cop, and an internal affairs officer to boot. The comments to this post are a despairing glimpse at the public perception of the police. The consensus was that she didn't have a lot of options short of moving, because everyone knows that the cops do not hold their own accountable, and that reporting a police officer for misconduct will more likely make your life worse than it will theirs. The police are responsible for policing themselves with predictable results. And meanwhile, calls to have independent civilian oversight of police departments, such as recently made by New York Attorney General Letitia James, are met with dismissal from those in charge and howls of anti-police agenda from the comically abhorrent police unions. Despite rhetoric to the contrary, police departments aren't largely being defunded or are being refunded after being defunded. And despite more rhetoric to the contrary, there's been no correlation between cities that defunded police and a rise in crime compared to the cities that did not. And meanwhile, on television, we have show after show where the police are not only the incorruptible good guys, but often have to work outside the system in order to mete out justice. Police sometimes just have to rough a guy up to get the truth. Wouldn't you? After all, torture works. Spoiler, it doesn't. It wasn't that long ago that New York police officers abused Abner Louima by sodomizing him with a broomstick, and yet for some reason we as a culture are still happy to accept positive portrayals of police brutality on television and film. Is it any wonder that so many police officers seem to idolize a psychopathic murderer of a fictional character, like the Punisher, instead of a more upright superhero like Captain America? Police are fed warrior mentality nonsense that tells them that they're the only thing standing between innocent people and the wolves who are out to prey upon them. And whatever they have to do to stop the wolves is justified, even if the wolf in question is only passing maybe a counterfeit bill, or even just happens to be in a house in which the police mistakenly think there is criminal activity. And conservatives buy into this narrative of the police as the only thing standing between good people and bad people. The fact that the distinction between them often falls on class and racial lines must surely be only a coincidence. So of course you should pile funding up on the police, give them military surplus, give them whatever they need to be our heroes. Back to the matter at hand, plenty of kids' shows have good guys and bad guys, but so few clearly divide their cast into categories of criminals, civil service law enforcement, and innocent civilians who need to be protected. So of course Adventure Bay should pour as much money into law enforcement as possible. Outfit the Paw Patrol with all manner of military gear, every high-tech gizmo. They're the thin blue line that keeps Adventure Bay safe. The fact that the real reason Paw Patrol needs constant infusions of new gear is so that Spin Master can keep pumping out toys even lines up in a metafictional sense with reality. The real reason American police departments are so flooded with surplus military gear is that the government constantly buys excess gear that the military doesn't even want as pork barrel for military contractors who give heavily to political campaigns, and so it needs a way to dispose of it all. Everyone knows this about the military, and yet there is no will at all to do anything about it in or out of Congress. Isn't capitalism grand? It's been well documented at this point that conservatives don't understand irony. I'm not being glib, there's actual studies to back this up. I don't mean that every individual conservative doesn't get irony, but it's a common trait to them as a group. This is why liberals get comedy shows like Colbert, The Daily Show, Last Week Tonight, and so on, to skewer current events and show the emperor has no clothes. Conservatives, meanwhile, get unspeakably earnest, unhinged tirades from the likes of Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, and at worst, Alex Jones. The fact that anything could be worse than the lightly veiled fascism of Tucker Carlson tells you how far we've fallen. What does pass for conservative comedy is typically found in the smug dickishness of folks like Steven Crowder or Ben Shapiro, where simple cruelty takes the place of irony. Conservatives also value hierarchy. Going back to Edmund Burke, the father of conservative ideology, conservatism has been concerned with maintaining existing social hierarchies and relations, particularly concerning class, race, and gender, and draping this defense of the status quo in the clothing of tradition, and through tradition, patriotism. Or as conservative YouTuber John Doyle put it,
conservatives believe in hierarchy and natural law.
In America, this belief in hierarchy and tradition usually lurks beneath the guise of meritocracy. The people who are wealthy are that way because they deserve it by merit, and the poor simply envy them. Why aren't there more women and minorities in executive suites, or in tech and finance in general? It can't be anything systemic or cultural. It must be because they're not naturally suited to it. The small government crowd, followers of Mises, Hayek, and Rand, will tell you that the invisible hand of the market will naturally sort the wheat from the chaff if it's just allowed to without interference, no matter whose lives are trampled in the process. The evangelical prosperity gospel crowd will tell you the order of things is divinely ordained, except the parts they don't like, which are naturally the product of the devil. And the wealthy and powerful will bankroll millions of hours of talk radio and conservative TV programs, will put money into the coffers of politicians on both sides of the aisle in order to make sure that their wealth and power continues to go unchallenged. After all, if the poor deserve not to be poor, they'd figure out a way to enrich themselves. Giving them anything they didn't earn just encourages them to stay poor. Forget the advantages the wealthy are born with. Forget the systems and prejudices designed to disadvantage the poor, and in particular minorities. Forget that some types of work like teaching and elder care just aren't rewarded on the level of others while still being necessary and valuable to society. No, poor people must be lazy. Otherwise, how could they be poor? And if more BIPOC are in prison than white people, that must also be because they deserve it. And thus the order of things self-propagates and defends itself. Where was I? Oh right, Paw Patrol. Let's look for a moment at the villainous Mayor Humdinger. His motivations generally consist of the fact that he's the mayor of the dreary, fog-covered town of Foggy Bottom instead of the bucolic Adventure Bay, and he is envious. Oh boy, is he envious. Of course, he could devote his energy to improvement of his own town, or simply renounce his mayoralty and move somewhere else. But he won't. Like a liberal trying to tax the rightful wealth of the billionaires instead of trying to make a billion themselves, Mayor Humdinger simply wants to take what isn't rightfully his. Almost all of his schemes revolve around larceny, after all, and everything about Humdinger's dress and demeanor practically shouts effeminate elite. Everyone on the show is happy with their lot, except for the villains. There are no artistic types in Adventure Bay to speak of, save maybe a film crew that occasionally comes through with a giant robot. People work simple jobs like mayor, farmer, restaurateur, and pet grooming salon keeper. The pups do sometimes interact with genuine aristocrats, though, spending a number of episodes working for the royal family of the Kingdom of Barkingburg, fending off the queenly aspirations of the uppity royal pet who wants to take the place of the rightfully born. It all lines up fairly neatly, even if unintentionally, with a conservative view of the order of things. In fact, the main thing here that doesn't line up with conservative ideology is that Humdinger and company are usually let off with little more than a slap on the wrist. At worst, he's given a broom and told to clean up his mess, which is hardly being tough on crime. Of course, there's two reasons for this. First, that no one wants to depict prison in a show for young children, and second, that they want the villains to come back and make more plots go. And it's ironically this second metatextual reason that most resonates with conservatism in our world. The purpose of the penal system for conservatives is twofold: to bestow punishment on criminals so that they suffer for their crimes, and to be able to use them in what is essentially a system of slave labor in which major corporations outsource their labor to prisoners who are paid pennies and generally don't have much choice in the matter. While liberals fight for prisons to be places of rehabilitation and education so that prisoners can rejoin society and become better people, and leftists would like to abolish prisons altogether, which is a completely different subject. Conservatives tend to see anything for the benefit of prisoners rather than their punishment as mollycoddling the wicked, using up valuable resources on people who don't deserve it. And yet, as is easy to see, if you let people out of prison with no skills beyond manual labor and no education beyond what they had when they went in, and you have a society that makes it difficult for people with records to get jobs, what you get is a recipe for recidivism. But in the conservative view, recidivism is simply the fault of the individual and proof of their poor moral character. Mayor Humdinger has no backstory, no explanation for what's made him the way he is. It's just his role to be the jealous type. And the role of the Paw Patrol is to defeat his larcenous plans, return property to its rightful owner, and restore the order of things. Everything must go back to the status quo by the end of the episode. And then Humdinger will cause trouble again. It's what he does. It's what he's for. In other words, law enforcement serves specifically to defend the status quo and property rights against a criminal element that exists not as a symptom of larger systemic problems like poverty and prejudice, but rather as a kind of inevitable portion of human society, those who are morally weak. It's almost too neat an allegory for the conservative view, which often views this criminal element as less than human, at times even directly referring to them as animals, and certainly viewing them as less valuable than the property they might steal. And we know that police value property more than human life. One only has to look at the person they murdered because he was accused of passing a counterfeit bill. Hell, police will openly warn the public to unquestionably obey what police officers say if they value their lives, because apparently disobeying a police officer is a capital offense in the United States. At least, if you're poor, and particularly if you're not white. If pushed, conservatives will say that the police are the line between order and disorder, with order being code for the status quo. Conservatives legalize the automotive murder of protesters, rush to the defense of their murderers, and cheer at their deaths not because protesters are lawbreakers after all, but because they dare try to disrupt the status quo. They dare try to make things better for themselves and people like them. People who conservatives believe belong where they are and deserve to be treated the way they are. To reiterate, it's probably not intentional that Paw Patrol so neatly captures the way police work in our society and a larger conservative worldview. I don't think its creators sat down with the intention of doing anything more sinister than sell toys. But I think that by lazily using an incredible array of tired, unexamined tropes and constructing a world built around a rescue law enforcement organization with a bewildering array of high-tech gizmos and vehicles, they've accidentally made a right-wing paradise to rival anything Glenn Beck could have come up with. And even if we don't consciously register how this presentation affects how we think of the world and the police, it does. And it especially does for our children who gleefully dress up as these characters and pile up their toys. It's an easy example of the principle that every piece of media is political, and if you don't think it's political, then it's probably just defending the status quo. And in some cases, you're defending it more aggressively than others. Hey, don't click away yet. Like and subscribe. And also, did you know there are exclusive writer's notes on Patreon about this and every episode, available for only $1 for each episode going forward? And you also get early access to episodes. As always, bibliography and further reading are in the show notes. More info about the show and other formats in which it's available can be found at literatmachine.com. Special thanks to my patrons, Kevin Cafferty, Wilma Zekowitz, Industrial Robot, Bristol Kolev, Benjamin Pence, Jason Quackenbush, Nancy S. Rosen, and Arthur Rosenfield. Thank you.